The first thing Claire Morgan noticed was that the weeds had won. They pushed through the gravel driveway, curled around the empty loading bays, and climbed the chain-link fence surrounding what had once been one of the busiest fruit tree nurseries in the county. The faded roadside sign was still there. The gate was chained shut. Everything about the property looked abandoned, except the trees. Claire had driven past the nursery dozens of times without thinking much about it, but that afternoon, something beyond the fence made her ease off the accelerator. Rows of green, she slowed her pickup. Then she stopped. There weren't dozens of trees behind that fence. There weren't hundreds. There were thousands: apple trees, pears, peaches, plums, cherries. Some stood in large nursery containers. Others had been planted directly into long-growing rows. Weeds had begun creeping around them, and months of inconsistent care were starting to show. A few looked weak. Others were still astonishingly alive. Claire sat behind the wheel for several seconds, staring. She owned a small 28-acre farm less than 15 miles away. She wasn't a wealthy commercial grower, but she knew enough about fruit trees to understand what she was looking at. These weren't seedlings. Many had already spent 3, 4, perhaps 5 years growing, years of watering, years of fertilizer, years of pruning, years of somebody showing up every morning, believing those trees had a future. Now nobody seemed to want them. A few days later, Claire learned why. The nursery had been losing money for several seasons. Rising operating costs, weak sales, mounting debt, and one particularly difficult year had finally pushed the business beyond recovery. The equipment was sold, the employees disappeared, the office was emptied. Anything that could easily be liquidated was removed, but nearly 3,000 fruit trees remained. Moving them required trucks, equipment, labor, fuel, and somewhere else to put them. Selling them individually could take months. The property didn't have months. The land was scheduled to be cleared for another use. That meant the trees were no longer considered valuable inventory. They were an obstacle. If nobody removed them, contractors eventually would. Some would be ripped from the ground. Some would be chipped into mulch. Others would simply be hauled away. Claire tried to tell herself it wasn't her problem. Her own farm already demanded more money than she liked to admit. Her savings were supposed to protect her when machinery broke or a season went badly. She had no business rescuing someone else as failed. Nursery still, she could have stopped thinking about those trees. 3,000 of them. Thousands of years of accumulated growth, and soon most of it could disappear into a wood chipper. The following morning, Claire found the property owner's phone number. She told herself she wasn't calling to buy anything. She only wanted to know what was going to happen. At first, the conversation was ordinary. Then Claire asked the question she hadn't been able to stop thinking about. "What are you doing with all of those trees?" There was a pause. The owner told her they needed to be gone within 30 days. Claire looked through her kitchen window toward the empty acreage on her own farm. Then, almost before she could stop herself, she asked another question. "How much do you want for them?" He gave her a number. Claire froze. For a moment, she thought she had heard him wrong. Her fingers tightened around the phone. "I am sorry," she said. "Could you say that again?" $2,400, Claire didn't answer. She had expected 10,000. Maybe 20, possibly more, even neglected. Nearly 3,000 established fruit trees represented years of work. At retail, many individual trees could sell for dozens or even hundreds of dollars, depending on their size and variety. Yet the number she had just heard worked out to less than $1 per tree. It sounded impossible. There was a reason the property owner wasn't really selling trees anymore. He was selling a problem. The nursery had already gone through bankruptcy. Valuable equipment had been auctioned. The irrigation system was partially dismantled. The office had been cleared. Now the property itself needed to be emptied. The trees were the final major obstacle. Hiring a contractor to remove thousands of them would cost money. If Claire took them, the owner could collect $2,400 and make the responsibility disappear. But there was a condition, actually, several. Claire had to take the trees exactly as they were. Nobody would help her dig them. No equipment was included. Transportation was entirely her responsibility. Any tree damaged during removal was her loss, and every tree she wanted had to be gone within 30 days. The bargain suddenly felt different. Claire drove to the nursery and walked the property with the owner. From the road, the trees had looked impressive. From inside the gate, they looked overwhelming. Row after row stretched farther than she remembered. Some trees remained in nursery containers and could be loaded relatively easily. Others had been planted into growing fields. Those had spent years developing root systems deep in the soil. Apple, pear, peach, plum, cherry. Different sizes, different ages, different conditions. Many appeared to be between 3 and 5 years old. Claire knew the retail value. On paper, the deal looked almost absurd. spend $2,400, receive nearly 3,000 established fruit trees. Even if half survived, surely there had to be money in that. But Claire had farmed long enough to understand something dangerous about bargains. The purchase price was rarely the whole price. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table with a notebook. Her emergency savings totaled a little more than 11,000. She wrote, "Purchase $2,400. Then she started another list: fuel, trailer rental, excavator, labor, straps, tarps, irrigation, stakes, hoses, soil amendments, replacement parts. Then came the largest problem of all. Where was she going to put thousands of trees? By midnight, Claire was staring at 2 pages of expenses. The deal no longer looked like $2,400. It looked like a project that could swallow most of the money she had spent years saving. The responsible decision was obvious: walk away. She closed the notebook, went upstairs, turned off the light, and lay awake, because one thought refused to leave her alone. The nursery had already done the slow part. Someone else had spent years growing these trees. If she could move them, she would just be buying plants. She would be buying time. The next morning, Claire called the owner. Her stomach tightened as he answered. She knew that once she said the words, there would be no pretending this was just curiosity. He'll take them. 2 days later, she handed over $2,400 and signed the agreement. Nearly 3,000 trees were now hers. So was the deadline. 30 days. Standing beside the first row with a shovel in her hands, Claire felt the excitement disappear. Buying the nursery had taken minutes. Getting it home might cost her everything. The first tree took nearly 40 minutes. That was when Claire understood what she had actually purchased. Not 3,000 cheap fruit trees. A logistical nightmare. The trees planted directly in the nursery fields looked manageable above ground. Below the surface was another story. Each one had spent years building roots far beyond the width of its trunk. Dig too close and Claire would destroy the root system. Dig farther away and the root ball became heavier. Much heavier. She worked a circle around the first tree, cutting through soil and carefully exposing larger roots. Sweat ran beneath her cap, despite the cool morning. When the tree finally came free, the root ball was so heavy that 2 people could barely shift it. Claire stared at it, one tree. Nearly 40 minutes, she looked down the row. Hundreds of trunks disappeared into the distance. Then came tree number 2. Tree number 3. By lunchtime, Claire had stopped thinking about the $2,400 purchase price. The real cost wasn't to the trees, it was everything required to move them. She began making calls: a compact excavator, a skid steer with forks, trailers, fuel, straps, tarps, temporary irrigation. The estimates rose quickly. Professional tree-moving companies could have solved the problem. But when Claire heard their prices, she knew that option was impossible. Hiring specialists to move thousands of established trees could cost more than her farm was worth. So Claire built the cheapest operation she could. One small excavator, her pickup, a borrowed flatbed trailer, 2 farmhands willing to work brutally long days, and Claire herself. Then another problem hit her. Her own farm was tea-ready. 28 acres had always sounded large, now it seemed painfully small. Thousands of trees couldn't simply be scattered wherever there was open ground. They needed spacing. Drainage, access lanes, irrigation, room for equipment. The placement decisions she made in the next few weeks could affect the farm for decades, so Claire worked 2 jobs at once. During daylight, she rescued trees. After dark, she marked planting rows at home. Her headlights swept across the fields while she measured distances and hammered stakes into the ground. Some nights, she ate dinner after midnight. Other nights, she couldn't remember eating at all. Sleep became something she borrowed in small pieces, and the money began disappearing. Fuel, repairs, rental hours, irrigation pipe. Every unexpected problem seemed to have a price attached to it. 5 days into the project, Claire checked her bank balance. Her chest tightened. The $2,400 she had worried about spending now looked almost meaningless, but there was a number that frightened her even more. Time after the first full day of digging, loading. Hauling, unloading, planting, staking, and watering, Claire walked through the new orchard and counted. 37 trees. She stood there for a moment, too tired to move. 37. She had started with nearly 3,000. That meant approximately 2,963 were still at the nursery. At 37 trees per day, they would need around 80 more days. Claire had 29. For the first time since signing the agreement, the excitement vanished completely. Maybe everyone else had been right. Maybe the trees weren't cheap. Maybe they were cheap because nobody could afford to save them. Claire looked across the 37 trees standing on her farm. Then she imagined nearly 3,000, still behind the chained nursery gate. She had spent years building a financial cushion. Now she was watching it disappear, and unless something changed immediately, she was just going to lose the trees. She might lose the farm trying to save them. Claire arrived at the nursery before sunrise the next morning. She did not bring a shovel, she brought a clipboard. 37 trees per day was too slow, it was fatal. At that pace, the deadline would arrive while thousands of trees were still standing. Claire couldn't add more hours to the day. She was already using nearly everyone she had. So instead of working harder, she had to stop working the same way. Until then, everyone had done everything. Claire dug. The farmhands wrapped roots. Then all three stopped to load. They drove to the farm. Then everyone stopped again to unload. Too much movement, too much waiting, too many minutes disappearing between tasks. Claire divided the rescue into stages. The excavator would keep moving. One operator would loosen soil around the trees and expose the root balls. The farmhands would follow, trimming damaged roots and wrapping the soil securely. Claire would manage loading and trailer rotation. At the farm, planting holes would be prepared before the next load arrived. No one waited for anyone else. The first few hours felt chaotic. Then the numbers began changing. By lunchtime, they had already passed 37. By sunset, they had moved 78 trees, the next day 91, then 104 for the first time. Claire felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel. For days' hope, she began tracking every trailer load. The container-grown trees went first because they could be moved quickly. Several could fit onto one trailer. Each fast load bought them time for the difficult trees later. But Claire knew the numbers were flattering them. The largest trees were still waiting. Those trees had the most years invested in them. They were also the hardest to rescue. Word spread through the local farming community. At first, neighbors came to watch. Someone had apparently bought an entire failed nursery for less than the price of an old utility trailer. People were curious. Then curiosity became help. One neighbor lent Claire another flatbed. Another arrived with a tractor. A retired orchard worker watched the crew struggling with a root ball and showed them a faster way to wrap it without losing soil. Nobody could stay forever. But an extra tractor for 4 hours meant dozens more trees. An extra trailer meant another load before dark. Slowly the nursery changed. Rows once filled with green became strips of empty soil. Claire's farm changed in the opposite direction. Bare ground became apples, pears, peaches, plums, cherries. 10 days passed, then 18, then 25. Claire's arms ached constantly. Her clothes smelled like diesel, wet soil, and sweat. She had stopped looking at the balance in her savings account unless absolutely necessary. But the numbers on the clipboard finally suggested the impossible might actually happen. More than 2,000 trees had been moved. The system was working. Claire began to believe they could finish. Then, one evening, she checked the weather. She refreshed the forecast. Then refreshed it again. A strong cold front was moving south. Temperatures were expected to fall sharply. There was a serious possibility of a hard overnight freeze for established trees rooted safely in the ground. That might have been manageable. For recently dug trees with damaged roots, it could be devastating. Claire drove back to the nursery. Hundreds of trees were still standing. Some were small. Some were among the largest and most valuable trees on the property. She checked the forecast one more time. 4 days, the 30-day contract suddenly didn't matter. Nature had just given her a new deadline. And nature did negotiate. 4 days wasn't enough. Claire knew it before the first trailer left the nursery that morning. Until then, the mission had been simple: save everything. Now she had to do something much harder. Decide what deserved to be saved first. Claire walked the remaining rows carrying a roll of marking tape. Healthy trunk, strong branches. Manageable root system. Mark it, good structure. Mark it, large but still movable. Mark it. Then she reached the questionable trees. Some had been stressed by months of inconsistent watering. Some had damaged bark. Some had broken branches. Others showed weak growth or root problems. 2 weeks earlier, Claire would have tried to rescue everyone. Now every hour spent on a weak tree could mean losing a strong one. She stood beside one struggling apple tree longer than she needed to. There was no dramatic reason it affected her. It was simply another tree, but leaving it unmarked felt like making a decision about whether something living deserved a chance. Claire hated that. She hated the deadline. She hated the weather. Most of all, she hated that she had been arrogant enough to believe she could save everything. Eventually, she moved on. The tree remained behind, then another and another. For the first time, the rescue felt like failure. The crew worked faster than they ever had. The excavator barely stopped. Root balls were wrapped while trailers were loaded. One truck pulled onto the road as another returned. Neighbors came back when they heard about the freeze. Nobody needed to explain the urgency. For 2 days, the operation ran almost continuously through every hour of daylight. Claire stopped counting individual trees. She counted trailer loads. The weather kept coming. On the third morning, frost covered the grass. It wasn't to the hard freeze yet, but everyone knew what it meant. Then Claire encountered another crisis. Her farm was filling faster than planting holes could be prepared. Trees were arriving before permanent spaces were ready. Leaving their roots exposed wasn't an option, so Claire dug long temporary trenches. She placed the trees inside and covered their roots with loose soil. Then she soaked them with water. It wasn't ideal. Nothing was ideal anymore. Every choice became a compromise. Speed against care, quantity against survival, money against time. Late on the fourth afternoon, Claire stood near the nursery entrance as the final full trailer pulled onto the road. She watched it disappear. Then she turned around. The property looked almost empty. Almost. More than 300 trees remained. Some were too weak. Some were too large to move safely with the equipment they had. Others had simply run out of time. Claire had bought nearly 3,000 trees. Approximately 2,640 reached her farm. She had wanted all of them. Reality had allowed fewer. That night, temperatures fell below freezing. By morning, thin ice had formed on buckets outside. Claire walked through her new orchard before sunrise. She touched trunks, checked soil, examined branches. Nothing looked obviously dead. That should have comforted her, it didn't. Transplant shock could take days or weeks to appear. A tree could look perfectly healthy and still be dying. Her financial position was too much better. The trees had cost $2,400. Saving them had consumed most of what she was willing to risk. Claire now owned thousands of trees, but not one of them had made her $1. Several weeks later, while she was replacing stakes, a local orchard grower named Walter stopped by. He had heard the story. He wanted to see what she'd rescued. Walter walked quietly through the rows. He examined tags, graft unions, bark. Then he stopped beside an apple tree and wiped dirt from the faded label. He looked at Claire. "Do you know what you've got here?" Claire almost answered, "An apple tree." But something in Walter's expression stopped her. He moved to the next tree, then another. His expression changed again, and suddenly Claire realized something that made her forget the cold, the debt, and the exhaustion. She had spent a month desperately saving trees. She had never stopped long enough to find out exactly what she had saved. Walter spent nearly 2 hours walking through Claire's orchard. The longer he looked, the quieter he became. That silence made Claire nervous. She followed several steps behind him, carrying a notebook. Every few minutes, Walter stopped to examine a nursery tag or inspect a graft union. Claire had sorted most of the trees by fruit, apples together, pears together, peaches, plums, and cherries farther down. During the rescue, that had been enough. Walter was looking at fruit type. He was looking at variety. He stopped beside an apple tree and brushed dirt from its tag. It belonged to an older heirloom variety that had largely disappeared from ordinary garden centers in the region. A few rows later, he found another uncommon variety, then another. Claire's notes became faster. The Bankrupt nursery had not only supplied ordinary homeowners. Before it failed, it had also served specialty growers, small orchards, and customers looking for cultivars that big-box retailers rarely carried. Mixed into Claire's thousands of rescued trees were heirloom cider apples, long storage pears, specialty plums, older cultivars with smaller but more dedicated markets. Claire went inside and found the boxes of nursery records that had come with the purchase. Until that day, she'd barely opened them. There had never been time. Now she spread the paperwork across her kitchen table. Walter was right. Hundreds of trees were potentially more valuable than Claire had realized. For a moment, relief washed through her. Maybe she hadn't destroyed her finances after all. Then Walter told her the varieties weren't the most important discovery. He stopped beside a group of apple trees. "How old do you think these are?" 4 years, Claire said. Some were 3. Others were closer to 5. Walter nodded. That was the real value. Young fruit trees were easy to buy. Time was tea. A customer could purchase a small tree cheaply. Then came years of watering, pruning, training, protection, waiting. The trees standing on Claire's farm had already survived those years. Someone else had paid for their youngest, most vulnerable seasons. Someone else had absorbed the cost of irrigation, fertilizer, pruning, mortality. Claire suddenly remembered the abandoned nursery. The weeds, the chained gate, the trees waiting behind it. She had thought she was saving plants from a wood chipper. Now she understood what would actually have been destroyed. Time, thousands upon thousands of accumulated growing years, and she'd purchased those years for less than $1 per tree before removal costs. The realization changed the way she looked at the orchard. Until then, Claire had imagined one obvious future. Keep the trees, wait, harvest fruit, sell it, but waiting for fruit meant more years before substantial income. Walter suggested another option. Not every customer wanted to start with a tiny sapling. Homesteaders wanted orchards sooner. New acreage owners wanted landscapes that already looked established. Small farms wanted to expand without starting from year 1. Some landscapers needed mature specimens. Those buyers weren't purchasing the cheapest tree. They were purchasing a head start. Over the next week, Claire built the inventory she should have made from the beginning. variety, approximate age, condition, location, possible use. When she finished, the spreadsheet surprised her. She didn't own 2,640 versions of the same product. She owned dozens of different products. Some ordinary, some damaged, some rare, some potentially worth many times what she had paid. Claire stared at the spreadsheet late into the night. For months, she had asked one question. How much fruit could these trees eventually produce? Now another question formed. What if she didn't have to wait for the fruit? The next morning, Claire selected 12 of the healthiest mature trees. She cleaned them, photographed them, wrote down their varieties and ages. Then she listed them for sale. She expected a handful of inquiries. By evening, her phone would not stop buzzing. By the next morning, Claire had more messages than trees listed. At first, she assumed it was curiosity. Then she started reading carefully. One customer wanted an apple tree. Another wanted pears. Several asked for specific varieties, but a surprising number asked the same kind of question. How big is it? How established is it? How long before it looks mature? Claire read those messages twice. They weren't comparing her trees with other established trees. They were comparing them with waiting for months. Claire had been thinking like an orchard farmer. Plant, water, prune, wait, harvest, sell. But the customers messaging her were revealing another business. Claire divided the rescued trees into 3 categories. The first group would stay. These were healthy trees that made sense for a productive mixed orchard on her 28 acres. They represented Claire's long-term future. The second group would be sold. Healthy, established trees that could survive another careful transplant. Claire stopped describing them as simply apple or pear trees. She emphasized what they really offered. Here's the third category, consisted of unusual varieties and trees useful for propagation. Claire began learning more about scionwood, grafting, and the specialty cultivars the old nursery had maintained. One failed business had handed her 3 possible businesses. But none of that mattered unless customers actually paid. Claire priced the first 12 carefully. Part of her still remembered what she'd paid, less than $1 per tree. Charging serious money for one felt almost dishonest. Then she reminded herself what it had cost to rescue them. Fuel, machinery, labor, water, risk, sleepless nights, and years she hadn't personally had to wait. The first customer arrived that weekend. He owned a small rural property and wanted 2 apple trees. Claire showed him several options. He walked past the smaller ones. Then he stopped beside 2 established trees. How long until these look like real trees in my yard? For the first time in weeks, Claire laughed. Not because the question was foolish, because it perfectly explained what she had failed to understand. They already looked like real trees. That was the product. The customer bought both. When his payment reached Claire's hand, the amount wasn't enough to change her life, but emotionally. It felt enormous. For months, money had only moved in one direction: out fuel, rentals, repairs, labor. Every dollar spent had felt like proof that she might have made a terrible mistake. Now, for the first time, money came back. Claire watched the 2 apple trees leave her property on a trailer. She felt something unexpected, part relief, part sadness. She had fought to save those trees. Now she was watching them leave again. But this time they weren't headed toward a wood chipper. They were headed toward another piece of land where somebody wanted them. Claire listed more trees. A homesteading couple bought 6. A small farm bought 12. Another property owner wanted flowering fruit trees along a driveway. Her rescued inventory began shrinking. Then a message arrived from someone she didn't know. He wasn't asking for 1 tree or 6 or 12. He was developing a rural property and wanted apples, pears, peaches, and plums. 40 trees. Claire stared at the number 40. This wasn't a purchase, it was an orchard. They discussed varieties, spacing, pollination, and delivery. Near the end of the call, the customer asked a final question: if I buy all 40, can you plant them too? Claire looked outside at the rows she had fought so hard to create. For the first time, she realized something important. Maybe the tree itself was only half of what people were willing to pay for. Claire didn't answer the 40-tree customer immediately. Planting 40 mature fruit trees was nothing like delivering 40 small nursery pots. She knew exactly what the job required. That was what frightened her. The land had to be evaluated, rows measured, spacing calculated, pollination considered, holes prepared, root balls protected during transport. Each tree had to be positioned correctly. Backfilled, watered, and supported. Months earlier, the idea would have overwhelmed her. Then Claire remembered what she had just survived. Nearly 3,000 trees, 30 days, a freeze. 40 trees suddenly didn't sound impossible. It sounded familiar. Claire already had the trailer. She already knew how to move large root balls. She already had access to the equipment. Most importantly, she had learned through hundreds of mistakes what not to do. She calculated the price of the trees, then delivery, then planting. She hesitated before giving the customer the final number. He agreed. That single yes changed the business again. Claire had assumed buyers wanted fruit trees. What many of them actually wanted was the result those trees represented. They didn't want to spend years watching a small sapling become established. They wanted to walk outside and see the beginning of an orchard. Now Claire couldn't eliminate biology. A transplanted mature tree could still experience shock. It still needed recovery. It still required proper care. She couldn't promise immediate heavy harvests, but she could offer something meaningful. A head start. Soon more inquiries arrived. Homesteaders, small farms, families who had purchased acreage, property owners creating rural homes, even a landscaping contractor searching for larger fruit tree specimens. The market wasn't enormous, but that became part of the opportunity. Established trees were difficult to move. That was exactly why fewer businesses wanted to sell them. Claire changed her listings. Instead of posting random individual trees, she began creating packages. 5-tree backyard orchard, 10-tree mixed orchard, larger packages for acreage owners, where pollination mattered. She paired compatible varieties. Customers stopped thinking about one tree, they started thinking about an orchard. Average order sizes increased. For the first time, Claire could see a believable path toward recovering what the rescue had cost. The irony made her smile. The same problem that had made the trees nearly worthless to the failed nursery was now protecting her from competition. Moving mature trees was difficult. Claire knew that better than almost anyone, but another customer soon revealed the next problem. She delivered 8 trees to a family about 30 miles away when Claire arrived. The owner proudly showed her the planting holes he had dug by hand. Claire looked at the holes, then at the huge root balls, then back at the holes they weren't remotely large enough. Technically, Claire could have unloaded the trees and left. Instead, she stayed. She helped correct the planting sites, adjusted the depth, explained drainage, positioned the trees properly. By the time she drove home, the sun was dropping behind the fields. Claire was exhausted, but her mind was moving quickly. The trees had value. Delivery had value. Now she just spent hours giving away something else. Knowledge, equipment, experience. The ability to make a difficult job manageable. The following week, Claire edited every listing. Below the tree prices, she added one line: delivery and professional planting available. Her phone began ringing almost immediately. Within 2 weeks, Claire realized something strange. Customers were almost as interested in the planting service as they were in the trees. That finally made sense to her. People loved the idea of an established orchard. They didn't love what it took to create one. They didn't want to measure spacing. They didn't want to rent an excavator. They didn't want to haul enormous root balls. They didn't want to spend an entire weekend digging holes, only to discover they'd done it incorrectly. They wanted to look outside and see an orchard. So Claire started selling the outcome. Instead of quoting only for trees, she created complete packages: tree selection, delivery, site preparation, planting, staking, initial watering, basic irrigation setup when needed. For larger properties, Claire also helped customers choose varieties based on sunlight, drainage, pollination, harvest timing, and available space. The 40-tree project became her first serious test. Claire brought back 2 workers who had helped during the nursery rescue. Early that morning, they loaded the selected trees. For a moment, seeing the trailers full again brought back memories. Claire hadn't expected the desperate 30-day rescue. Cold mornings, empty fuel cans, the fear that she had ruined herself. Only now the trailers weren't draining money. A customer was paying for them to move. By the end of the first day, 40 established apples, pears, peaches, and plums stood in organized rows behind the client's house. Claire stepped back. The field had changed completely. That customer hadn't bought 40 objects. He had bought the beginning of a place his family might enjoy for decades. Claire photographed the completed orchard. Then she posted the project. More calls followed. 10 trees, 1825. Some customers still collected individual trees themselves. Others wanted everything done. The installation work transformed Claire's economics. The trailer that had once terrified her every time she filled it with fuel now generated delivery income. Equipment that had once been a rescue expense became part of a paid service. The transplanting knowledge she'd gained through exhaustion and mistakes became something customers valued. Claire hired extra workers only when projects required them slowly. Without ever planning it, she had built another company. She wasn't only an orchard farmer, she was installing orchards. Meanwhile, something quieter was happening on her own land. Winter passed, the first warm days of spring arrived. Claire walked the rows almost every morning, checking the trees she had feared wouldn't survive. At first, she saw nothing. Then one peach tree produced tiny buds. Another followed, then pears, then apples. Within weeks, blossoms spread across sections of the farm. Claire stood among them one morning without saying anything. Months earlier, Many of these trees had been waiting behind a chained gate to be destroyed. She had dragged them through mud, wrapped their roots, raced to freeze, spent money she was sure she'd ever recover. Now bees were moving between their flowers. For Claire, it was the first time the rescue truly felt alive, but she still faced a difficult decision. Approximately 2,700 strong trees remained after transplant losses. Tree sales and installation projects. Every one of those trees represented cash. Selling them could give Claire something she had in months. Financial security. She studied her spreadsheet. Then she walked outside into the blossoms. For months, she had learned how to profit from the trees she sold. Now she had to decide whether the most valuable trees might be the ones she refused to sell. For several weeks, Claire walked the farm carrying her inventory sheets. This time she was deciding which trees could leave. She was deciding which trees would never leave. That distinction changed the way she saw every row. Until then, a healthy tree always had a number attached to it. 1 apple tree could become a sale. 10 pears could become an installation project. A group of peaches might pay another equipment bill. Selling trees created immediate relief. Keeping them meant waiting, and Claire had already spent enough of her life waiting for money to come back. Approximately 1,700 strong trees remained. She began evaluating them differently. Health, variety, pollination, harvest period, fruit quality, storage potential, processing potential. Some apple varieties were excellent for cider. Others stored well deep into the season. Certain pears could extend sales. Peaches and plums would produce before the main apple crop. Claire began imagining not one orchard but a calendar. Different fruit ripening at different times. Different products. Different reasons for customers to return. She marked the strongest combinations. Those trees stayed. Then the phone rang. A customer wanted several large trees. Claire had already reserved. The offer was good. Claire looked at the numbers. Months earlier, she would have accepted before the customer finished speaking. Now she said no. After the call ended, she remained sitting at the kitchen table. Turning down money felt unnatural after everything she'd been through, but something had changed. Those trees were no longer inventory. They were assets. Still, Claire knew simply growing fruit and selling it wholesale wouldn't make the most of them. Large commercial growers could produce fruit more cheaply than she could. Competing with them on volume would be foolish, so she looked beyond the fruit itself. The first idea was simple: a roadside farm stand, peaches in summer, plums, pears, apples in autumn. Then mixed fruit boxes for local families. Next came products using fruit that was visually perfect. Cider, preserves, apple butter, jam. A bruised apple might be difficult to sell individually, but it still contained juice. An oddly shaped plum still had flavor. Processing could turn waste into revenue. Then Claire looked at the orchard itself. People already enjoyed visiting when they purchased trees. What would happen once the branches were full of fruit? You pick weekends, seasonal visits, families walking through the rows. The same trees could earn revenue without ever leaving the property. Claire drew everything on paper: you-pick section, farm stand production, specialty cider varieties, access lanes, parking, customer areas. Nothing was guaranteed. A late frost could destroy blossoms. Disease could cut production. Storms could knock fruit onto the ground. Customers might never arrive. Keeping the trees meant keeping all the risk. Claire knew that better than anyone. But it also meant keeping the upside. Months earlier, she believed the opportunity was buying 3,000 trees cheaply. Then she believed the opportunity was selling them. Now she saw the next layer. A tree sold once could pay her once. A tree kept healthy might pay her season after season. So Claire made the decision. Approximately 1,700 trees would remain. She turned down buyers, stopped listing selected varieties, and committed a large part of her farm to an orchard that still hadn't proven it could support itself. Then she waited. The trees flowered. Fruit began forming, and Claire prepared for the harvest that would finally tell her whether keeping them had been wisdom or another expensive mistake. 2 years after Claire signed the agreement for the abandoned nursery, her farm barely resembled the property she had once known. The biggest change arrived in late summer. Fruit everywhere. Apples hung from branches that had once been tied to trailers. Pears pulled limbs downward. Peaches softened in the heat. Plums colored beneath the leaves. Not every rescued tree had recovered perfectly. Some remained weak. Some produced lightly. Others had been lost completely. Claire never forgot that. More than 300 trees had never left the nursery. Others had died after transplanting. The story had never been about saving everything. It was about what survived, and now enough had survived to produce a real crop. Claire walked through the orchard early one morning. She reached up and picked an apple from one of the rescued trees. For a few seconds, she simply held it. There was nothing extraordinary about the apple itself, but Claire remembered where that tree had come from. A bankrupt nursery, a chained gate. 30 days, a hard freeze, a bank account disappearing faster than she could refill it. She smiled. For the first time, the gamble could be measured in something other than trees moved or dollars spent. The orchard was producing. The farm stand opened first. Claire kept it simple: fresh fruit, mixed boxes, a few locally produced items. People who had originally contacted her to buy trees began returning to buy fruit from them. Then came the You Pick weekends. Claire opened only a small section at first. She had no idea whether anyone would show up. The first morning was painfully quiet. Claire stood near the entrance, wondering whether she had misjudged the idea. Then a car turned in. Then another. Then another. Families walked between the rows, carrying bags and baskets. Children searched for fruit they could reach themselves. Customers stopped Claire to ask about varieties they'd never seen in supermarkets. That surprised her. The heirloom and specialty trees Walter had identified years earlier were valuable for another reason. Their fruit made Claire's orchard different. She began labeling varieties. Some were best for eating fresh, others for baking. Several apples were excellent for cider. That led to another opportunity. Fruit too small or blemished for premium fresh sales didn't need to be wasted. Claire sent part of the apple crop for pressing. Cider turned lower-grade fruit into another product. Preserves did the same for other varieties. Waste fell. Revenue per harvest improved. And most importantly, Claire's farm was no longer dependent on one way of making money. By the second full season, 3 main income streams had emerged from that single failed nursery: established tree sales, orchard installation, and the permanent orchard, fresh fruit, You Pick, farm stand sales, cider preserves. Seasonal visitors. None of them made Claire an overnight millionaire. That wasn't the point. One evening she pulled the original purchase paperwork from a drawer. There it was. $2,400. Claire laughed quietly. The number looked almost ridiculous now. The trees had never truly cost $2,400. There had been equipment, fuel, labor, irrigation, repairs, losses, sleepless nights, fear. More than 300 trees had never even escaped the nursery. Others died later, but the original price explained why the opportunity had existed. The bankrupt nursery hadn't really been selling $2,400 worth of trees. It had been trying to escape a problem. Claire had accepted the problem, and hidden inside that problem were years. 3 years of growth. 4. Sometimes 5. Years that could never be manufactured overnight. Years that would have disappeared forever in a wood chipper. Claire looked out toward the orchard as the evening light moved across the rows. Every harvest was now making those rescued years more valuable. And none of it would have happened if she'd driven past the abandoned nursery without slowing down. Years later, visitors to Claire's farm usually saw the finished version. They saw organized rows stretching across the property, families filling baskets during You Pick weekends, boxes of apples and pears stacked at the farm stand, bottles of cider, jars of preserves, customers arriving to discuss new orchard installations. What they didn't see was where it began. The weeds, the abandoned loading bays, the chained gate, the broken irrigation system, the 30-day deadline. The morning Claire counted 37 rescued trees and realized 2,963 were still waiting. Those details mattered because the opportunity had never looked like an opportunity. To the failed nursery, the trees were inventory it could no longer afford to maintain. To the property owner, they were obstacles preventing the land from being cleared. To a contractor, they were material that needed removal. To most buyers, they represented an impossible amount of work. Everyone saw the same trees, they simply saw different value. Claire had known the rescue would succeed, it almost didn't. She had known customers would buy established trees. She discovered that afterward. She hadn't planned an orchard installation company. Customers created the need. She hadn't begun with visions of You Pick weekends, cider, preserves, and farm stand sales. Those ideas emerged one problem at a time. First, save the trees, then keep them alive, then figure out how to recover the money. Then decide which trees should stay. Then find ways for those trees to create value year after year. Nothing happened according to one brilliant master plan. Each problem forced Claire to see the next opportunity. And that was why the $2,400 purchase price could be misleading. The deal sounded almost effortless when reduced to one sentence. A nursery went bankrupt. Claire bought 3,000 fruit trees for $2,400. But the reality was different. Equipment had to be rented, workers paid, fuel purchased. Thousands of trees dug, thousands of root systems protected, irrigation expanded, land prepared, savings drained, trees lost. There was no guarantee Claire would recover any of it. That uncertainty was exactly why the opportunity existed. If moving thousands of established fruit trees had been easy, the nursery could have sold them normally. If their value had been obvious and immediately accessible, someone else would have paid more. The trees were cheap because their value was trapped behind an expensive, exhausting problem. Claire was willing to solve that problem. Some rescued trees eventually went to homeowners. Some became orchards on other farms. Some provided propagation material. Approximately 1,700 became the foundation of Claire's own long-term orchard. One bankrupt nursery unintentionally supplied the raw material for several new businesses, but years later, Claire still thought about the first afternoon. She stopped beside that fence. She hadn't known which varieties were valuable. She hadn't calculated the installation business. She hadn't predicted the farm stand. She hadn't imagined families picking apples beneath branches that were nearly destroyed. She had only understood one thing. Those trees had already spent years becoming what they were. Years underground building roots. Years above ground building structure. Years being watered, pruned, protected. Those years had already happened. The nursery could lose the money invested in them. But once the trees were destroyed, nobody could manufacture those years again. One evening after the last U-Pick customers had gone home, Claire walked alone through the orchard. The rows were quiet. Empty baskets sat near the farm stand. A few apples remained high in the branches. She stopped beside one of the oldest rescued trees and rested her hand against the trunk. Years earlier, that tree had been standing behind a locked gate waiting for a contractor. Now its branches stretched over productive soil on her farm. Claire looked across the orchard. Thousands of growing years surrounded her. That was what she had bought for $2,400. Not simply trees. Not simply fruit. Not even a business. She had bought time that somebody else was about to throw away. And sometimes the most valuable opportunity isn't something nobody can see. It's something everyone can see, but nobody else is willing to save.